Good afternoon, everybody, and good evening to our online audience. Welcome to this IEG event on water supply and sanitation. I'm Caroline Hyder. I'm the Director General of the Evaluation Office here at the World Bank Group, and we are the host of this event. We're very happy to be organizing an event on water, which is really the linchpin to existence on planet Earth. When you think of it and you review the Sustainable Development Goals, the agenda for 2030, you would see that water is present in many of the SDGs. Water is explicit in SDG 6, which is today's topic on water supply and sanitation services to people and for people. But it is also present, very importantly, in SDG 14, which is about oceans, seas, marine resources, and that we have to respect them and manage them and use them in ways that we preserve them, that we renew them, and that we consume them in ways that is responsible. So that creates an enormous challenge to juxtapose these two SDGs, and that's not even thinking of other major consumers of water like agriculture and industries, and find ways of how do we do this in a new, in a different way, in a sustainable manner. Today's event is about how the World Bank Group has helped client countries address the gap in access to water supply and sanitation. Because while at the big picture, the challenge is of how do we manage this scarce resource in a reasonable way, in a way that's sustainable and will last for generations to come, at the actual delivery of water resources to people, it's really important to think about what does that look like in the future. Equity is a major issue. As my colleague Rama will be speaking about, there are still so many people who do not have access to water, and those who do have access to water might not have the quality or the reliability or the quantity of the services that they should be having. Things that we here in North America, in some parts of North America, take for granted are a real challenge for many people around this world in the client countries. And so today's event, we will first have a presentation by Ramachandran, who will speak about the findings of our evaluation that reflects on how well the World Bank Group has helped client countries achieve this, followed by a panel discussion which will be facilitated by my colleague Jose Carbajo. So let me invite Rama to the podium. Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline. Thank you, everyone, for being here. And thanks to my management for being supportive throughout this report, for the great team that I had the opportunity to work with. So let me jump into the evaluation straight away. The evaluation addressed two overarching questions. How effective was the World Bank Group in supporting client countries to improve water supply and sanitation services? How well is it equipped to support client countries in keeping with SDG 6? SDG 6 has raised the bar greatly. It's well known that worldwide there are at least 600 million people without safe water supply and 2.4 billion without adequate sanitation. Lack of access is particularly concentrated in sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, East Asia, in low and lower income, middle income countries, and among the urban and rural poor. SDGs are now the core business of the World Bank Group, and thus SDG 6 now frames the World Bank Group's strategy for water supply and sanitation. SDG 6 has raised the bar greatly from simple access to water supply and sanitation to sustainable and universal access to adequate, reliable, safe, and affordable service delivery by 2030. SDG 6 calls for an investment of $1.7 trillion over the next 15 years, 3 times historic levels. This is an ambitious target, given the sector's poor cost recovery record, traditional dependence on public funds, and low and uncertain fiscal transfers. Cross-sectoral impacts are increasingly affecting water supply and sanitation. First, unregulated self-provisioning of water in urban areas is placing undue stress on groundwater quantity and quality. Second, unregulated wastewater and sludge disposal is causing serious groundwater and surface water pollution. Third, climate variations are giving rise to greater uncertainties in water availability. On the positive side, new and decentralized technologies and the expansion of the digital economy and the Internet of Things hold great promise to address several of these issues. This figure and table show how low tariffs and poor cost recovery are pervasive in the sector among many client countries. In particular, East and South Asia are far behind other regions in these respects. The World Bank Group provided $30.3 billion in support to the sector between 2007 and 2016. Of this, the World Bank accounted for 93%, IFC 5%, and MEGA 2%. As can be seen from this table, low-income countries receive the lowest share by far of World Bank assistance, and none at all from IFC and MEGA. Rural areas received in sub-Saharan Africa and urban areas in South Asia received relatively less attention, as you can see from this picture. Small town areas where the problems of the future are brewing received very low emphasis. In sharp contrast to the expectations of SDG 6, there are glaring gaps in the World Bank's tracking of service delivery parameters. This is especially so for adequacy, quality, and reliability of sanitation in rural areas and affordability across the board. This goes to the heart of accountability of service providers to consumers. When it comes to focus on the poor, only 15 out of 152 World Bank projects rated by this evaluation had key performance indicators for people classified as poor. However, the World Bank's recent WASH poverty diagnostic, covering 18 countries across 6 regions, can help refocus on the poor. In respect of monitoring and evaluation generally, only 33 projects, or 22%, had favorable ratings. Lack of baseline data, inadequately defined parameters, and poor feedback to operations are common. Overall performance of the portfolio. Of 152 projects, 107 projects, 71%, had moderately satisfactory or better development outcomes at project completion. However, of these 107 projects, 45 projects, or 42%, had substantial or high risk to development outcomes, greatly reducing the impact of the bank's $28.4 billion assistance in the last 10 years. The risk arose by far from a lack of financial sustainability. This links to the finding, and that doesn't appear here, this links to the finding that only 4% of the 152 projects that we looked at did only 4% had financial viability reflected in their project objectives. And the addendum to this is the sustainability ratings, or the risk ratings, do not even reflect environmental sustainability, which can take far longer to become apparent. Yeah. The bank did try to insert financial covenants into several projects, but as this table shows, the impact was marginal at best. The World Bank has supported client countries to address cross-sectoral impacts on water supply and sanitation in some prominent cases. However, there is little evidence of a systematic approach to these issues across the World Bank's global practices, or to support client countries to achieve interministerial coordination to tackle these issues. In particular, no new models appear to have been developed for lower middle-income countries where the need is the greatest. The World Bank has successfully supported a community-based model when it comes to rural water supply in countries including Indonesia, India, Nepal, Peru, and Sri Lanka. Continuous attention to capacity building, especially by the Water and Sanitation Program, or WSP, was an important feature of this effort. However, the long-term sustainability of rural water supply depends on ongoing financial and technical capacity and support from local governments. And there needs to be a transition strategy as rural areas grow into small towns and merge with peri-urban areas. On the behavioral change front, the World Bank has supported behavioral change among service providers in a few cases. For example, it supported radical change in the corporate management approach and work culture in Lima in the Sedapal utility. It has also supported incentive mechanisms to reduce non-revenue water losses in Phnom Penh and Ho Chi Minh City. Behavior change for hygiene and sanitation, which acts as a huge drag on rural sanitation efforts, was very sparse. Only 14 projects approved during 2007 to 16 included components for behavior change in hygiene and sanitation. Even in these efforts, formative research and monitoring and evaluation were inadequate. Value addition of global programs, WSP and WPP, PPIF and GPOBA, in maintaining an edge is recognized by the evaluation. IBNET has played a pioneering role in benchmarking utility performance and has the potential to expand on this by leveraging new digital technologies and the Internet of Things looking forward. From all the foregoing, three overarching messages are worth highlighting. Without tackling financial viability and service provider accountability head-on, the World Bank Group cannot provide credible support to countries to move towards SDG 6. Cross-sectoral impacts are reaching crisis proportions in many countries, and new technology and business models and collaborative arrangements must be pursued with client countries. To these ends, the sector must leverage digital technology and the Internet of Things. So the recommendations are framed around the points that I have touched upon in the preceding slides. Engage intensely with client governments on sector reforms to strengthen the financial viability of service providers, and to create conditions for increased access to commercial finance in keeping with the new cascade approach. Enhance engagement for reducing disparities in access between and within countries and urban and rural areas. Increase cross-sectoral collaboration to address complex water supply and sanitation related challenges, such as municipal pollution, groundwater over abstraction, and resilience to climate-induced events. Align the results frameworks and key performance indicators of World Bank projects with SDG 6 needs, and support countries to build their evidence base for water supply and sanitation service delivery. Enhance knowledge, or continue enhancing knowledge and learning in the water supply and sanitation sector in client countries, building upon partnerships that already exist, and further capacity building. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much, Rama, for your presentation. Now we start the panel part of the launch event, and I'm going to follow it, or rather precede it with a series of housekeeping announcements. To all of you in the audience and also people who are following us online, you can Twitter at #goal6, which corresponds to the SDG in the water. And you can also provide questions. You can ask questions through www.polev.com/IAG now. Also, and I'm going to abuse a little bit my position as moderator, this is to remind all of you that IAG has launched its annual client survey, which is closing on April 13. And that you are more than welcome to go to our website, click on the link, and complete it. We are true believers of user experience, and therefore, if you can give us your feedback on how we do, the products that we produce, and how we do things like this launch event. Now, having done this logistics, I'm going to now proceed to introduce my panel members. I'm going to do it one by one, and then ask an opening question. And once we have gone through this first phase of the questioning, then I will open up for the audience. First, I'm going to start with our two guests, one representing private sector and one representing academia. On my left, I have Usha Rao Monari, who is currently the Chief Executive Officer of Global Water Development Partners, which is the water investment platform of the Blackstone Investment Group. Prior to this, Usha spent more than 20 years in the IFC, working in advisory in a number of countries. So she has a vantage position of being now in the private sector, but knowing these institutions very well. So I'm going to start with you, because obviously there is a huge challenge, as represented in this report, in terms of the investments that we need to undertake, not just the World Bank Group, but the entire investment community, in order to achieve and to make progress for the SDG number 6, and that requires a lot of cash, a lot of mobilizing private capital. The question is, even though this is the case, we have, the World Bank Group has the analysis done in this report reflects that out of the 30 billion of investments, only 7% correspond to IFC and MIGA. So there is a lot of field to cover. Now, what is the point of view of the private sector? What are the opportunities? What are the things that need to be in place to make to really move the needle and try to improve the way the private sector participates in this sector, in this WSS?
Thank you very much, Jose, and thank you to you and Caroline. Thank you for inviting me to join this wonderful session. You're right, I'm a proud alumnus of the World Bank Group, and I go out in the world and I say, I used to work for IFC, and 100 out of 100 people are very impressed. So, I think this is a wonderful place to be. To your question, right, but coming out into the private sector, you really see where the issues are, I guess, because we guys put our money into projects and investments, and we kind of want it back at some point, and we want some sort of a return on it. And so when we look at the water sector, as opposed to any other infrastructure asset class, whether it's power or telecom and whatnot, investors are still nervous. So I myself sit back and I say, so why are we nervous? And there's a few reasons, right? One, but before I get to the reasons, let me give you my conviction. And this is what I told Blackstone or anybody else that I speak to. I believe the water sector has AAA rated cash flows. What does that mean? It simply means that if a rating agency were to look at cash flows coming out of water projects, they should rate them AAA because water is a completely and fundamentally needed resource. People generally shouldn't not pay to get a water service, theoretically speaking. However, all of us know that's not the case. And so the question becomes, why is that not the case? So when you sit back and you look at it from my point of view, there's a few reasons. Number one, water is a very local resource. It is governed very locally. And when it is governed very locally, the political economy surrounding water becomes very complex and sometimes almost impossible to navigate. So that's one thing. As a private investor, we don't know how to deal with that. So that's one big reason, right? Number two, water is very capital intensive. It needs a lot of money, as you correctly said, to actually put in place the treatment, conveyance, and other types of infrastructure design that is required to deliver water to the 600 million and everybody else that don't have water today. Wastewater treatment is a whole other story. As Jennifer will probably talk about it, it's even more capital intensive. So the question becomes, if you need that quantum of money to go into the sector, you need to have a tariff regime or a pricing regime that allows those people who put this kind of money in to get it out with a certain return. It doesn't mean enormous returns, but as a private investor, private equity investor, it's very difficult to say, I will put in $500 million or $1 billion into this particular water project, and I will get it back after 25, 30 years at a 6% interest rate or return. It's tough for us to do. So the question, from your perspective, Jose, and from the World Bank Group's perspective, the kind of money you go after in terms of alternative financing resources should also be looked at. It's probably not private equity. Maybe it's more infrastructure fund type money. Maybe it's other types of money, so you should look at that. And then finally, the biggest issue bothering private investors in the water sector is private investors don't believe that it is governed very well, and the off-takers, as we look at it, the off-takers, which are the utilities, are financially insolvent in most places. I hope, Jennifer, you talk about this. And the fact that the guys who buy the service that we invest in are financially insolvent and they can't charge the tariffs, et cetera, makes it a very, very difficult investment proposition. And that's basically where we're coming from. I mean, I think that the World Bank, which I think has done a wonderful job, to be honest, in the water sector. You talked about it already, about all the things they've done. In my view, humble opinion, should focus on raising the solvency level of the sector overall. Go to the utility level. And I was whispering to Jennifer, why haven't you done that? I didn't hear her answer, but I'd like to hear it now. Why haven't you done that? We used to call it, right, enabling environment. So from a private investor point of view, what is the enabling environment? And I want to stop with one counterexample from another sector. When you look at renewable energy, right, what was it, a decade ago? When did it become popular? I can't even remember, something like a decade ago, something like that. People didn't think much of renewable energy. People didn't think it was an investable infrastructure asset class. But it became a very investable infrastructure asset class. Why? For many reasons, but one big reason was that the governing bodies and governments and policymakers put in place something called a feed-in tariff. And the feed-in tariff allowed private, I don't want to call it private, alternative financial sources, alternative to multilateral and public and so on, to actually put money in, and in a certain first phase or what have you, to get a certain return. It wasn't an enormously high return, but it was good enough, and it was strong enough through this feed-in tariff mechanism for lots of money to pour into that sector. I've always asked, and I'm asking again, why doesn't water have feed-in tariffs or something similar? Maybe a feed-in tariff doesn't make sense, but something similar to that kind of incentive base, if you will, early incentive base to bring in alternative financial resources. So I'm going to stop there. Is that good?
That's very good, Usha. Thank you very much. I love it when the panel members set out the scene so well and they start already putting on the spot other panel members. I will come back to you, and I know that you have to leave a little bit earlier than the end. So thank you very much. Now I'm going to turn to my far right, Dale Whittington, who is Professor of Environmental Sciences and Engineering at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Dale is very well known. He's been working for more than 30 years in this space and worked with the World Bank and in many regions across the world. Dale, Usha has set out the scene very well. She has talked about the fundamental importance of financial viability, but also in order to, and the enabling environment in order to attract the private sector. Yet, as the report demonstrates, it's only in a very small fraction of projects that this financial viability is a target of the World Bank Group. What are we missing? Are we dropping the ball? Is it something that we are not doing right? Have we given up? What are your views?
Thank you, Jose. So I guess the question is, has the bank dropped the ball? I actually wouldn't single out the bank. I think the whole sector has dropped the ball here. And I think the sector has become comfortable with what appears to be the stable equilibrium of very low tariffs, low cost recovery, and periodic infusions of capital to fill the gap. So we've been comfortable with that for decades now, and we've been recommending the same kinds of pricing instruments now for decades, and they don't work, but we still keep recommending them. So that's a bit of a puzzle. I mean, why do we keep recommending the same municipal tariff structures when we know they don't work? I mean, I guess I would say maybe they have kind of worked in some sense, but Cape Town shows us that they're not going to work much longer. We have rising population, rising urbanization, we have climate change, and our recommendations on water pricing haven't changed. We're saying the same things that we've been saying. So what can be done here? I like the report's recommendation about engaging in intensive discussion with water utilities. I think that's right. But I'm not sure that we would know exactly what to talk about, or we would have a consensus on what those discussions should be. So I have three suggestions on what those discussions might look like. The first is really that municipal water utilities need to send a signal. The prices need to send a signal that water is scarce, and they need to send a signal about what it costs to deliver an incremental cubic meter of water. That's not so hard. I mean, we do this with seasonal water pricing in the United States. We do it with peak load pricing for electricity. Why can't we do this with water? I mean, this shouldn't be too difficult. I would say the second thing is we need to have tariffs that recover costs. This is clear in the report. We haven't been doing that. But we have to if we want to have a revenue stream that will finance capital. I mean, that's we're not going to get private capital coming into the sector with no revenues. I mean, this is just pretty obvious. And the third thing I would say is that we need separate programs to help poor households. We have to be sure that poor households are safe, but we are not going to be able to do that through the tariff. We've been assuming that we could do that through the tariff with increasing block tariffs for decades. We know it doesn't work, but we keep recommending them. So we need to deal with this head on and finance subsidy programs to make sure poor households can afford basic services. And two things about that. On the one hand, it's getting easier with big data and the ability to target poor households. We know who poor households are now if we want to do that. On the other hand, the experience from the United States and Europe is that addressing affordability issues is hard work. It's a continual negotiation, a continual engagement with poor households. And I think we've just been too lazy to say, we're going to solve this problem of poor households with increasing block tariffs. We need to get serious about making water affordable for poor households and at the same time charging realistic prices for others. So those are my 3 points. John Briscoe, if he were here today, he would say all water problems are local and all solutions are contingent. And I think all three of those points will get worked out in local situations with the political economy of cities, and that's as it should be. But that's doable. I mean, Vijay's here. He did that in Phnom Penh. I mean, this was hard, but it took years, and it took money, and it took intensive engagement, just like this report recommends. And now we have a big success story in Phnom Penh. So I think that's an example of what's doable.
Thank you very much, Dale. We are now developing a pattern here. There were 3 points that Usha made in her statement. Now you have 3 points. Jennifer, it's your time now to have your 3 points. Jennifer Sara is the Director of Water Global Practice at the World Bank with many, many years of experience in this sector and working across many world regions as well. Jennifer, you have heard our 2 previous speakers mention affordability, enabling environment, financial viability. To make matters even more interesting, more challenging for you, on top of that, you have these dimensions of what the so-called water challenge. In other words, to need to factor in climate change, urban issues, ecosystems in water sector interventions, what have you. Now, you just came recently from the 8th World Water Forum in Brasilia. How is the World Bank thinking about these things? Do you think that we have the structures, the resources? How, on one point that they also mentioned, the disruptive technologies that they are coming in as well. How all these things, all the multiple critical dimensions, what is the World Bank positioning itself to address all these very critical challenges?
Thank you, Jose, and thank you also to IAG for doing this study, because we found it to be incredibly useful. And we've had a very good meeting also with Cody and the management response, and you did a very nice job summarizing the presentation, Rama, but there's a lot more richness and wealth to it. And a couple surprises, and we were surprised, I think, on this issue that a lot of our projects are not going to the LICs, to low-income countries, but more to the middle-income countries, which we think is really important, and also looking at the issue of rural areas and small towns. And so that, for us, it's always nice when we have an IAG study that comes up with some results and things that you take a step out and look at those types of issues. And it's very important now as we move into the SDGs, SDG 6, universal access, but also IDA 18, where we have a lot of resources available to support that. Now, I know you didn't ask me about mobilizing finance and pricing and valuing, and sorry, but that is, of course, the core of everything that we do. And I look around the room and I see Alain Lecussol, I'm not going to say when, how many years ago, when I first went with him on a mission and I had to go to the PDAMs in Bali and look at their financial statements, if they existed or not, but even looking at the numbers, and look at Dale, when you did all that work on willingness to pay, we're still with the huge, huge challenge of willingness to charge, not just willingness to pay. So the political economy of water that you speak to has not been resolved, and we have years and years of experience in this room, and I agree with you that the sector has dropped the balls, and water supply and sanitation, I would say, is definitely a valid statement. I don't know if the banks dropped the ball or not, but we're really looking forward to finding ways to fix it. But I think what's exciting now is, as we look at the needs and the financing needs, and we have a whole new agenda of mobilizing finance or development, we've gone back to the basics. And we realize if our service providers and our utilities are not creditworthy, and they're not providing services, and they're not recovering costs for their services, it will be impossible to crowd in any money, and let alone private investment or domestic private investment, but even concessional money. Why should we keep on putting money into a leaky bucket, as we say, right? So I think coming back to that is going to be incredibly important, so we look forward to discussing that a bit more now. But your question was more specifically about a broader question that was not necessarily looked at in the IAG report, was looking at SDG 6 in its entirety, which is really about water resource management. It's a broad agenda on water resources in addition to service provision. And in fact, we're really fortunate in a way, because the water global practice was created exactly when the SDGs came out. And there was a big debate inside the bank, do we make one big water GP? And do we put water for irrigation and water supply and sanitation and water resource management all together under one umbrella? And we did that. And so we've always said we're very fortunate. Not only are we the implementation arm of SDG 6, but all the water-related SDGs. And Caroline, I think you mentioned the oceans agenda. But in fact, we say that water, you need water for 15 out of 17 of the SDGs. So water is required to deliver on the whole SDG agenda. Now, you want me to make 3 points, so I'll make three points. The one is about what we're going to call the new water narrative. How do we take action at the highest political level? And so we just came back from the World Water Forum, where at the World Water Forum we released the final report called Making Every Drop Count. And this is the report of a heads of state panel. So President Jim Kim and the previous Secretary General Ban Ki-moon convened a heads of government panel for the last 2 years that have been looking at global water issues. Now, it's the first time there's ever been a panel of 11 sitting heads of state. It's been a very, very interesting process to have them come together, but what they've basically came out with in this report is the need for a new water narrative, the need to look at water much more holistically across all the sectors. It has a number of recommendations, but a couple of that I think are really important. One is looking at the new water narrative that connects sectors, connects countries, but also the fact that if we want to manage our water, we actually have to know what kind of water we have. What's the data? There's a lot of gaps in what kind of, I'm talking about more water resources, but even with utilities. You go to utilities and ask water service and sanitation coverage, just having basic data, having governance structures and institutions, and most importantly, the valuing water. And I'm surprised, Usha, I was waiting for you to say valuing water. So we go on, we differentiate quite a bit. The valuing water, how do you value water across its competing needs? So ecological, social, and economic needs. How do you then price service delivery? So pricing service delivery of water-related services for water supply, sanitation, for irrigation, but also for ecosystems preservation. And then finally, the financing. So if you get the pricing right, and I think both of you have said that, then the financing will hopefully come. So I think that's also important to really be able to break it down to these levels. So that's the first point, the high-level political commitment and making clear what the issues are. The second one is, and I just brought with me now, being able to work together, and this is called the Synthesis Report SDG 6, Water and Sanitation. It says water and sanitation, but we know SDG 6 is much more than that. And this is actually great because we have so many different organizations working together on trying to have basic indicators and reporting. So the World Bank is a core member of this team, and we report back to the high-level political forum, but it's a huge challenge. So I won't go through all the slides, I don't have time, but the point is, how do we get into, I mean, honestly, measuring SDG 1 and SDG 6.1 and 6.2 on coverage rates for water supply and sanitation is probably the easiest part, even with their new qualifiers. But when we start talking about water use efficiency in agriculture, integrated water resource management, participatory management, transboundary management, this is all in the SDG 6, so that's the bigger water agenda. Put climate change into it, put energy into it, and all the other needs and that affect water and the amount of water. So measuring water is the second point. And the last, of course, and the most important is our client demand. So what do we do as a World Bank that puts $4 billion into water writ large every year, which is a drop in the bucket, $4 billion within the water GP and $4 billion outside the sector. So how do we shape client demand? How do we get governments to look at water holistically within the country, to understand about water security? So we have a new set of tools on water security diagnostics that also bring in the private sector. Nusha started the WRG 2030. So we bring in the industrial users of water, the private sector users of water, which we've never really put in the equation, and all the different stakeholder groups around different river basins, but how do they start looking at how they're going to manage water, the institutions to manage it, the data, and the valuation mechanisms for doing that. That's a big one. And the second one then, of course, is how do you invest in service delivery, and how now is our conversation with governments, if you need to achieve a universal access and you want to achieve 100% coverage, you really need to fundamentally rethink, we don't do ring-fence projects. And so are the bank's instruments the correct instruments? Do we need to look now at much more P4Rs? Do we need to look at more DPOs? And I think that's my last point, is on the DPOs, if we're going to go back and support the sector reforms that are required, maybe we need to rethink the instruments. It's not going to be through small ring-fenced investments, but really looking at the policy reform agenda again. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Jennifer, for setting out also the perspective from the World Bank Group. One of the things that I want to say with my IG hat on is that we really, really welcome your emphasis on data and on having the proper indicators. In fact, the evaluation report mentions the need to have better measuring data and also to look for the institutional accountability as a target, as a challenge. And we are developing learning engagement with the GP Water to identify those institutional indicators as part of this, as a byproduct of this evaluation. That's very welcome. I also couldn't help but noticing that the membership of this high-level panel forum of water. The presidential membership is quite fluid, if you forgive me the pun, because two of the members are Jacob Zuma and Pedro Pablo Kuczynski. And both of them, of course, have gone now to move on and do things. so I hope that the interest, in any case, remains. Having done this cheap shot that you allow me to, I'm going to open the questioning for the floor, please. If you were to identify yourself and then ask the question and who of the member of the panel you are addressing it. Thank you.
Ruhi Abdullah. I just wanted to thank Jami for this work. It's definitely very timely. I also had the opportunity to do a portfolio analysis last year for the World Bank. We looked at a last decade of projects at the World Bank and the findings that were presented at the Water Week last year. A couple of findings were in alignment. This is just a comment. They were in alignment with what has been stated by the findings of IEG. But what was interesting, we overlaid the data with the countries that are urbanizing rapidly and the countries that have least access to water. And we found out that the targeting at the bank was extremely weak. In terms of countries with less access were not being targeted. And the countries that are rapidly urbanizing are not being targeted. So that was a nuance. I don't know if Jami actually looked at the data based on a matrix of any other lens. And that might be an interesting perspective because it gives you insight on whether the targeting is, because I feel the targeting is the key. So if there are countries that have least access, why aren't we going after those countries and seeking them out as clients? For projects.
Very good, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Can I take 2 or 3 more questions and then we'll get them to answer as a group? Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you for this meeting. I think it's very, very nice for us to put all of this together in the report. My name is Amparo Gordillo. I work in the health sector and HMP here at the bank. One observation and maybe one pledge. I like very much the recommendations that our colleague presented. Yes, we need accountability, but accountability also from the perspective of seeing we offer water, but we need to offer in a more constant way and with a better quality. Coming from the health sector, water is the basis for us for achieve the SDGs. And the relationship of the disease in children younger than 5 years of age with the water that is not complying with the right quality is tremendous. And more than that, working in very low-income countries as we work, we have the water that reaches to the hospital that has coliformes. For those of you who don't know, that means brings bacteria and sometimes even parasites. For me, coming from the health sector, then comes the next thing that is the pledge. In the recommendations, they talk about let's work in a cross-sectoral way. I think this is the time because we have the umbrella of the SDGs. Why don't we try to put together a program in which we will allow us to work health more closely with water? In the health sector, we have what we call the community people on the volunteers. What is this? This is hundreds of people that work at the community level that could be trained on teaching how to keep the water fountains clean, how to put the chloro when it should be put, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So just 2 things.
Okay.
Wonderful, the accountability. Let's do the other recommendation, the cross-sectoral work.
Thank you very much. Let's take 2 more questions, people lining up, and then... okay.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Does it work? My name is Alain Locusser. I retired from the water sector about 11 years ago, but I'm still keeping an eye on what's going on. I have a comment on the report. I mean, I like the discussion on the chain of results. The report discuss output, outcome, maybe impact, never mention inputs. And I believe that it would have been very useful for IEG to comment on the mandate, the staffing, the skill mix, the budget, the procedures and the incentive of those who are in charge of water supply and sanitation project in the bank, and try to establish some kind of correlation between these inputs and the outcome of what we have been doing during the last 10 years. Related to that, I mean, I have a question. I mean, for decades, OECD reports and IEG reports have lamented about the poor financial performance of service providers that implement project financed by the World Bank. But at the same time, I mean, the capacity of the World Bank to financially appraise projects and to implement financial recovery plans for these service providers has been totally depleted during the last 20 years. And to add insult to injury, OPCS has issued OPBP 1000 that doesn't require a financial analysis of the project that we finance, even for those implemented by revenue-earning entities. So my question is, are IEG report on water aimed at improving bank policies and bank procedures?
Thank you very much. I'm going to allow you one more question. I don't know whether you were waiting for as well? I think you may have jumped the queue. If you don't mind. Yeah, she was ahead of you. So, yeah, you are next to the microphone. If you take a seat, then we take this question and then we move on for the next one.
Hello, my name is EJ Park. I have a quick question about the instrument choice that you mentioned. If there has been an assessment of the differential experience in using P4R, and moving forward, if we decide to use more P4R in the water section, what would be the opportunities and challenges that we will face?
Okay, thank you. You can formulate it quickly so that we can have
I'll
this
try
round.
quickly. I will, in the interest of quickness, I will be a little bit brash. My name is Jo Marie Griesgraber. I work with New Rules for Global Finance, and we've been assessing the effectiveness of global financial rule makers in reducing inequality according to their own mandates. Now, with that perspective, I would love to sort of pinpoint what Sarah has been talking about and looking at the connectedness, not just of across the World Bank and bank private finance, but the political power to bring all major financiers together, put it into the G20 and the FSB, and then challenge governments to actually raise the taxes to pay for what is a public good. And I think you named that people are not convinced that paying for water is comparable to paying to breathe air. So I think there is a social question to be addressed, and with that, a high difficulty in being concerned first with long-term profitability, because that may come later, but the first is how do you get the water to the people? So I think you have a huge challenge, and I wouldn't start with profit first. I know I'm being obnoxious.
Thank you. No, that's fine. I mean, we all recognize we have a big challenge. So here we have targeting the right countries, the links between water and other sectors, inputs, not only the skill mix, but the resources, but also the procedures that we have in place, and whether we need the new rules along the lines of convening power to have all the and accept the public good nature of the water. Why don't we start with you, Usha, because I know that you need to leave in about 10 minutes at the earliest.
Okay, I thank you, Jose, and thank you all for your questions. I don't think any of them were directed at me except the last one, so I'll address the last one. Madam, you were not being obnoxious at all. I share your concern about, the public good nature, right, of water. It is a public good. It is not the same as a, cell phone. But nevertheless, it is something that has to be paid for because there is investment that has to be made in it. The consequences of not paying for the investment that's made in it is that the investment won't come in. And so that brings to mind, okay, how do you look at the financial resources all over and how do you use them effectively? So if you look at public money, or even multilateral money for that matter, it's precious money. It's precious, precious money because it's low cost. How do you use that to bring in the billions of dollars that sits out there? And so there's various ways of doing it. My government, the Indian government, when they wanted to develop their highway program, okay, and they wanted the private sector to come in, well, they wanted to fund it. They didn't have enough money to fund it. They wanted the private sector to come in, and I'm sure there here are people who know about this. They raised a cess on petroleum sales, a 1 penny per dollar of, equivalent, if you will. And they raised that money not to pay for the highway development, but really to, if you will, guarantee returns to the private sector money to come in. So they use it as a guarantee fund more than anything else. And that raised a huge amount of money. So I just want to leave that with the group here, which is to say, Private sector money is plentiful, and it is extremely interested in the water sector. How do we then use the precious monies that lower cost or subsidized financing means? How do we use it more effectively to bring in the much, much larger amount of money without affecting the fundamental right to water or the fact that it's a public good? Because it can be done. And my worry on a daily basis that it's not being done, and I still don't know why.
Thank you very much, Usha.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your participation.
Thank you so much.
So, thank you, Usha, for your last questioning. I may invite my colleague Rama. Would you like to come here to the stand, and then you can help us also address some of the questions. So, Usha is off the hook because she had another meeting, but you two are not. So, and you have quite an agenda to answer to.
Dale, you're always so gentlemanly. No, thank you. These are all really good questions. The first one about targeting, we talked a lot about that because, how do you target versus client demand? I mean, ideally, we would love to go to every single country, that has huge unserved population to convince governments that they should invest in water and sanitation more than anything else. So I think for us, we've had what we've called the WASH poverty diagnostics. We've rolled them out in 18 countries in the last 2 years, and that's been fascinating because it's really, again, data. And having really good data and be able to present that to governments about who has service, who doesn't have service, and more importantly, the linkages with poverty and other types of indicators of well-being. And this has been very, very powerful to start. The governments recognize those are not being served. I mean, it's not a surprise to many of us, but there is such a clear linkage between the targeting and the poverty. But the other thing that's interesting is we did a study on utility benchmarking in Africa 2 years ago. And it was really interesting because we spent a lot of time arguing about what are the performance indicators to use for the utility. And I know Alain's probably sitting there horrified. How could we be arguing that? Because we already know the financial and the operational criteria. But the big question was about access. So we have these really well-performing utilities that serve the urban center and not the peri-urban areas. So do we say that's a well-performing utility, or if they're not mandated to serve the whole municipal area? So there's a big debate about that as well. So when you talk, it's important because there's always that challenge, right? You want well-performing utilities and you want universal access. So how do you bridge that gap? Amparo, your question also, the WASH poverty diagnostics revealed a huge surprise and horrifying surprise to us about water quality issues. And it was dramatic. I mean, we had so many country directors. I remember Nigeria, Tanzania, Ethiopia. Carrie's like, we spent billions of dollars, the government has, over all these years, and more than half the samples, there's coliform in all the boreholes. I mean, what do you do about that? So it's a huge issue. And and now the SDGs, as opposed to the MDGs, talk about water quality issues. So it's a new agenda for us to really be able to tackle that. And it comes back also to a lot of pollution from outside the sector, not just inside the sector. The other thing about cross-sector, we definitely want to work together, but we're already working quite a bit with HNP on the stunting agenda. If you look at nutrition and stunting, water and sanitation is a clear element of that. So we have good examples of working together in Pakistan, Rwanda, Tanzania. So hopefully we could do that also in your countries that you cover in Central America. Alain, we can have a private conversation on inputs versus outcome, but I think that's also a very good point about the depletion of financial analysts. You might be really pleased to know, though, with Joel Kolker now, we're building up a team. We've probably hired about 5 or 6 of them, because if we're going to crowd in additional finance, we definitely need to go back and look at, and we realized we had no financial analysts, so we're hiring them back in. And then finally, let me just talk on the instruments on the P4R. I'm enamored with P4Rs. We did the first one on rural water and sanitation in Vietnam. It was the first one in Vietnam. It was the first one in the sector. We now have one in India supporting the huge SWAT bar program of the government for having an open defecation-free India. We have a huge one in Egypt. I really like them because they look at access and sustainability. And more importantly, you can look at the incentives on the intergovernmental transfer systems and how do you incentivize good behavior and looking at longer-term investment, good investment, and also looking at sustainability. So we have about 5 or 6 of them being delivered this year, which is nice too because we have a learning across countries on how to design them better, but it forces government and other development partners to think about universal access and think about results and how do you finance for results. And the final point is just on this Vietnam one. I remember going back after 3 years, after we designed it, and going to one of the provinces where we worked in a few years earlier, where we had an input-based project, and it really was a dramatically different conversation. Previously, the local government was splitting up the resources across all the communities and not finishing any works. Now they realize we have to focus, get the investments done. They started talking to me about water quality and sustainability, which they never did for the 5 years I lived there. So I do see that it's a powerful instrument. Dale?
Didn't you answer everything? Yeah. Now, let me just take the last question, because I think it's a very important one, because it is actually the proposal to tax a population or bring in donor funds and provide free or very low-cost water is what we've been doing now for decades. And it has two basic problems, and I think it's really important to recognize what they are. It doesn't signal to use water wisely in a time of water scarcity and growing urban populations and climate change. So this is a fundamental problem with pricing water too cheap. The second is that those subsidies are not going to poor people, and this has been documented over and over and over again. So when you subsidize all of the water supply, the people that use more water get more subsidies. So the more water you use, the more subsidies you get. So this is the reason why this has to change. And the reason we're going to see it is situations like Cape Town. I mean, where we are trying to implement this vision and the pipes go dry. Maybe we're going to avoid day zero in Cape Town, but the point is that that's the future if we don't get this right.
Thank you very much, Dale. I'm going to use some of the questions that have been coming from online to also allow my colleague Rama to chip in, because Rama, you did quite extensive number of case studies in this evaluation, up to 10 country case studies. And one of the questions coming in is the following. Say, can the panelists speak about their experience and the studies that you have done about and the case studies and the political economy, structural barriers that are typically encountered in the water sector in terms of the incentives that are provided by the suppliers, but also by the consumers? And how do you modify behavioral? How do you affect behavioral change in order to, to improve the situation in this sector? You start with you, Rama.
Sure, thanks. Yeah. In the course of our case studies in several countries, what we find is that the political constituency for better water service does not coalesce naturally in contrast to electricity or telecom, because there is the opportunity for people to have recourse to self-provision for water. So in a typical dense urban situation, if water services are not good, people simply resort to either extracting groundwater or paying, or just succumb to the expediency of paying for water that's brought in by tankers or others. So this is these are the well-known but interactable issues in pulling together a civil resistance, so to speak. I mean, that's not the best term. To have public opinion, to have civil society force regulation, force better accountability of service providers. So this is the story that we encountered in the course of our case studies in several countries. How to break the impasse? That's, of course, a big question, but it should start with the main points that the report is trying to emphasize, which is institutional accountability. For that, you need to have a means of measuring efficiency of service providers. Further gets linked to financial viability. So these are all very interlinked issues that have to be unsnarled in creating this constituency. Yeah.
Thank you, Rama. So political economy, behavior change, what do you think, Dale?
So I think that's a great question, and I'm going to approach it this way. I think we really need to reconceptualize the role of the regulator in this situation. I mean, it's not to keep prices down. Prices are already too low. So it's really a role of an educator. I mean, the regulator needs to be engaged in educating the public sector about a lot of these issues that we've talked about in the report. I think the regulator has a variety of ways of doing that, but social media is one, the water bill is another. I think the regulator needs to think more broadly about communicating a series of facts about water and sanitation in their particular environment. In other words, water resource situation can be described by the regulator. Pricing can be described by the regulator, and teaching people about what it costs to provide services. Most people simply don't know. So I think the regulator needs to take on a different role.
Thank you. Jennifer, your take on that?
Not much to add. I'm really happy, though, you gave that example about why are people not out in the streets protesting, right? And Richard Amania had a really interesting session that we organized a few weeks ago in Singapore by several political economists who did an analysis of that, because you would think in a country like Nigeria, you know, where actually service coverage is going backwards, not forward. Why are people not out really up in arms? And exactly, that's one thing they said, is that a lot of people already have self-provision, and they have a different way, and they'd rather even pay more, even if it's a question of time and walking or poor quality water or storage tanks on the roof, because they can control it. And then that's something that they know, they put it in their budget. And so that actually was a surprise to me as well. I'm also surprised about this political economy and why we're not able to reform. And we worked so many years in West Africa, and some of the countries where we are best performer countries in terms of tariffs and regulation are going backwards now. And so what do we do as a bank? We're, again, a small little drop in the bucket. We have our projects. We can either put financial covenants and they don't meet them. We stop dispersing, or do we not put them as financial covenants? How do we have that negotiation? And I think more and more, again, it comes back to data. And it comes back to data and information, and new technologies can help that a lot. So it's upwards and downwards accountability. And so an opportunity to be able to benchmark service providers, but also let consumers know, consumers who are connected and not connected to the service, who's getting service, who's not getting service, and looking at a reform agenda that comes from the bottom and all the way up to the top.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. Now I want to open the questions to the floor again. If there are anybody who wants to elaborate on these topics or any other related. Just try to keep your question focused and tell us who you are, and also if you want the member of the panel that you would like.
Good afternoon. I'm from Mozambique and I go by Simon. I was concerned with all the discussion around how to price water. I'm thinking, on the one hand, we have this problem with water as it has this huge user value, but historically the exchange value has been low. On the other hand, different countries, different regions have different endowments of water resources, even though the whole planet has more water than land or anything else. And also, it's not a traded good. So what's the rationale of having a world price for it, let's say, or a benchmark like we have for oil and gas? In the developing world, like the situation you see in the Cape Town or what else, or in Mozambique where I'm from, we have, historically, the cities were not built to accommodate population growth, at least not the kind we've experienced in the past 40 years or so. It was built for mostly a minority and averaging, say, 1 or 2% growth. And also, the very existence of townships or peri-urban areas is more of an effect of, it's a result of the fact that the countries are not growing. So they're not growing, they're not building cities, they're not urbanizing. And the very few opportunities to improve a living standard is to be closer to the city. At least your kids will be closer to school or university, which happens to be the only school in the country in some cases. So my question is, how do we find a balanced mix of looking at water situation in part as just an effect or part of one of several problems we have with development in general? And if we're going to price it, and we cannot quantify all the benefits of it, but at least we can be cost effective about it. But how do we reach that balance? I mean, has that been the debated discussion inside the World Bank?
Thank you. Any other question from the floor? Here comes another question. Thank you.
Thank you for the presentation. My question is in terms of climate change. We already know that the water is scarce. Is there something that the bank is working on in terms of catastrophe funds, in terms of like if there's another episode like Cape Town, or is there any possibility within the current World Bank projects there's like a flexibility that one might create or think about? That's it.
Thank you. Do you want to start?
I'll try to tackle the question that the first questioner asked. These are several. You have touched upon several points, and what you have pointed to goes back to untangling several issues that are connected. One is to pin down service providers to efficient functioning, which in turn gives the basis for price. Yeah. 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 So. Yeah. So. Sorry. So it's really this interface of service provider accountability, of financial viability, which will allow us to price water properly and enable cost recovery. It's not an elaborate answer, but I'm emphasizing that these issues are highly interrelated.
Would you like to?
Sorry. I think this last question about pricing flexibility in climate change is terrific. And the water sector has really lagged behind other sectors in terms of changing prices to adapt to local water conditions. So it relates to the issue of water resource pricing with reservoirs in times of drought. In times of drought, you need to price water differently. But more importantly, you need to have a plan on what you'll do when things get scarce. And that's what Cape Town didn't have. And that's what utilities all over the world don't have. They don't have a plan for how they're going to change prices to adapt to scarcity conditions or drought conditions. So I think this is exactly what I was talking about in terms of seasonal water pricing. I mean, we need to have flexible water prices, just like we have flexible prices for telecoms and cell phones. I mean, so I think this is exactly an area where the bank could be very much a leader in helping people think through what the plans should look like.
Thank you.
So thanks, Dale. Let me also take the climate change question. You know, we say that variability is our new norm. So basically, we're working. It's a world of managing water extremes, either too much or too little. And so everything we do, and that's what we're doing now. We said for a long time, we used to say, you know, let's fix the pipes, and then let's fix the institutions that fix the pipes. And now we're like, let's make sure there's water to put into the pipes, right? So it's definitely core to everything that we do now. Is we're starting to design our engagement. I think what's important, it brings us back to the basics of integrated water resource management, the 3 I's that we always say. And we need to basically have the sound information, the institutions and the infrastructure and the incentives to really get how do you govern and manage your water resources and across the competing needs that you have for water and in a very uncertain, unpredictable situations. The issue of water utilities in Cape Town is fascinating because we do actually provide quite a bit of technical assistance. We did Sao Paulo, we do it in Cape Town as well, and it's exactly true. It's an institutional failure. It's not just the water utility. They hadn't really set themselves up in Sao Paulo either to be able to manage under an extreme drought situation, to have alternative water supplies. They didn't make the investments they needed, and it doesn't always mean you invest in new infrastructure, but you could actually invest in buying water from farmers or finding other solutions for water. The other thing, but the interesting thing about Sabesp, and Jerson Kelman was originally going to be on this panel, is the CEO of Sabesp. What they did is they did demand management. That's the first thing you do when you have reduced supply. And so they increased the prices and they incentivized people to use much less water. And it was so effective that even after the drought, people continue to use less water, and now the utility's in a financial crisis because they can't meet their needs. So it's a really interesting, and I think so now, again, it's the new norm for everything that we do.
Thank you very much. I don't know if there are any more questions from the floor, but yeah, Rama wants to rejoin there.
One point that was not addressed very quickly. Alan talked about staff mix and skill mix, which is a very valid question. But one of the purposes of our raising issues and making recommendations is, like the oracle, we point. We don't say what's right or wrong. So once the implications of what we are recommending are thought through, some of these should, we expect, fall out naturally. That's my personal opinion. And for instance, Jennifer had mentioned greater use of DPLs as one example of how thinking through some of these issues that we are highlighting might lead to specific options, specific actions. Thanks.
Thank you very much. What I wanted to do next is a quick round with my three panelists here, because you have so much experience just looking at your bios. You have worked across the world, you have worked in different countries with even sectors that are related to infrastructure and water. And I was wondering, to lift the spirits a little bit, can you tell us just one example of one set of interventions or a particular intervention that moved the needle, whether at the institutional level, at pricing level, financial level, of all the challenges that we have been describing? I'm going to start with you, Rama, because certainly the report mentions best practice examples or good practice examples in some countries. Please relate to us one of them.
Sure. We have tried to point out in the report some good practice examples from Colombia, where the bank has been involved, and Brazil, where the question of financial viability has been addressed better than in other situations. So financial viability is not, as we know, is not simply cost recovery. As long as we pay attention to efficiency parameters and make sure that public money is directed to cover that, that appears to be a far more desirable solution. And that's not exclusive to the water sector. It applies equally to the energy sector, the electricity sector in many ways. So that is one example. Well, these are upper middle income country situations where they were probably better disposed in terms of capacity and other ground situations, which enabled them to reach this level of regulation and enforcement. But there is a priori no reason why these cannot be replicated in other situations.
What about you, Jennifer? Do you have a good example of a country?
Well, I'm trying to be really upbeat, right? Because I think of all our good examples, we always want to do more, right? And so the bar keeps on changing. You think you've met the MDGs in some countries, and now you have SDGs, and putting the whole issue of equity and water resource management and continuity and reliability, we move the goalposts. And so can I say there's one perfect country? I'm not going to say that. I don't think there is, but there's a lot of good knowledge and lessons and way forwards that we're exchanging across countries. But what I was very happy to do is that in December, I went back to where I worked in Bolivia about 28 years ago. And I went to villages. You never ever go back to villages where you work on community water supply and sanitation projects. And you meet the next generation living in that same village. And I actually found a few hand pumps that were still working, which is, most of them were not, but they actually had 3 different systems coming on top of it. So they went from hand pumps to pipe water. So again, it comes back again to coming back to the very basic, the human face on the other side, that you're talking, this is about women and children and men, it's people and it's water and it's their life. And so the more that anytime you design an intervention with that in mind, I think is where you're going to get the sustainable outcomes.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Maybe I'll come back to the point I was making about helping poor households outside the tariff structure. Over the last few decades, we've been looking at the Chilean example. But there are other cases out there now that are really worth looking at and learning from about how do you help poor households make services affordable that are not just relying on cheap piped water supplies. I think the USAVE program in Singapore is a really interesting example where public housing units get help paying tariffs The targeting is based on ownership of a public housing unit, and the smaller units get more rebates. And so the rebates are provided every quarter or every 6 months to help pay a package of water bills. And what's interesting about that is it gets to the point in the report about cross-sectoral linkages. I mean, we don't want to worry about just water being affordable. We want to worry about water and electricity and other infrastructure services as well. So this is a rebate that helps for a package of services. And there's a lot of interesting experimentation going on in the U.S. about how to help poor households that fall behind in their water bills. And one thing is actually help with technical fixes, stopping leaks. People need help trying to figure out how to reduce their water bill. So it's not just the financial assistance, it's also technical assistance and various kinds of social nudges. But the point I would emphasize is that some of these programs really take hard work. You got to do the heavy lifting. There's no simple, easy fix for this, but if we want to help poor households have affordable services, that's just what we have to do. I mean, it's important, hard work, and we've got to go out in different cities and make it happen.
Thank you very much, Dave. I don't know if there is any other burning question from the audience. Anybody who would like to ask? If not, I'm going to end up, I think you will agree with me, I'm going to bring it to a closure with one final question. And I would like the answers to be 2 words from each of you. This is always the challenge at the end of these sessions, of these launch events. And that is that, and this is another of the small or big elephants in the room. It turns out, and Rama gave me the feedback, that 10 years ago, in 2010, IEG produced a report. I think it was IEG, right? Yes. Water and Development, an evaluation of the World Bank support. Okay? Some of the findings were lack of clarity in approaches to cost recovery. Sounds familiar? Sanitation receives far less support than water services. Water quality monitoring parameters are declining. Attention to economic analysis is declining, etc. So a number of issues that are very familiar with the findings that we have now in this most recent report. So this is the key question, and you have maybe 2 or 3 words. Which is the one thing that you would like to change or what you will target in order for us to be 10 years down the road, we have been able to say, no, we have moved the needle. Now these things have changed, have improved. I'm going to give you a little bit of, Dave, go ahead.
Subsidy programs outside the tariff.
Excellent. Jennifer?
Valuing water.
Institutional accountability.
With that, ladies and gentlemen, we have a whole program. We have a whole reform agenda program. Thank you very much for all my panelists, and thank you all of you and those online that have followed this launch event.